The world often notices greatness only after it has become too large to ignore. Before a name is placed in books, before a statue stands in a public square, before students repeat a thinker's words in classrooms centuries later, there is usually a quieter beginning. There is a room, a child, a misunderstanding, a silence that others mistake for emptiness. History rarely begins with thunder. More often, it begins with someone being overlooked by the very people standing closest to him. Imagine a young man walking through a crowded school in the Middle Ages. He is unusually large, slow in his movements, calm in a way that makes others impatient. He does not rush to speak. He does not compete for attention. When other students argue, laugh, and show off their cleverness, he remains still, listening as though every word has weight. To them, his silence looks like weakness. To him, silence is where thought gathers strength. His classmates give him a cruel name. They call him the dumb ox. They see the ox, but not the mind hidden behind the lowered eyes. They see the body, but not the storm of questions moving quietly within him. This is how the world often fails. It judges the surface quickly, because the surface is easy. It does not know how to wait long enough for depth to reveal itself. But one teacher sees what the others cannot. He watches the silent student carefully, the way a patient farmer watches a field before the first green appears. Then one day, after hearing the young man speak, he understands. This is not stupidity. This is not slowness. This is power held under discipline. The teacher tells the others that the one they call an ox will one day be heard across the world. That young man was Thomas Aquinas, and his life would become one of the most remarkable journeys in the history of thought. He would not conquer cities, command armies, or wear a crown. He would spend his life with books, prayer, arguments, and silence. Yet from that quiet life came a bridge between faith and reason, between ancient philosophy and Christian belief, between the questions of the mind and the hunger of the soul. If stories like this help you slow down and see history not as distant facts, but as human lives filled with fear, courage, doubt, and wonder, consider subscribing to the channel. And as you listen tonight, you are welcome to share where in the world this story is finding you. Sometimes a quiet story travels farther than we imagine, especially when it begins in the silence of one forgotten room. Now let the noise of the present day fade for a while. Leave behind the glow of screens, the pressure of unfinished tasks, the restless habit of rushing from one thought to the next. We are going back to a world of candlelight, stone walls, monastery bells, and dangerous ideas. A world where a question could change the shape of a life. A world where one silent boy would spend his days asking what truth really is. To understand Thomas, we must first understand the world that was waiting for him. Early 13th century. Italy was not a single peaceful country. It was a broken mirror of city-states, noble lands, castles, monasteries, and territories claimed by powers that never stopped struggling against one another. Loyalty could shift with marriage, money, fear, or revenge. A family name was not only an identity, it was a fortress. The Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor fought for influence over the Christian world, and their conflict reached into cities, homes, and bloodlines. Families took sides. Neighbors became enemies. Streets could turn into battlefields over loyalties that ordinary people barely understood. In one city, a political argument might close markets. In another, it might lead to fire, exile, or death. Power was not an idea written on parchment. It rode on horseback with armed men. For common people, life carried a constant uncertainty. A farmer might plant in peace and harvest in fear. A merchant might begin a journey with goods and prayers, knowing that roads belonged as much to bandits as to rulers. Even inside city walls, safety could feel temporary. Violence did not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived with banners, sometimes with whispers, sometimes with a family grudge older than anyone who still remembered its beginning. And yet, in that same age of fear, Europe was building beauty with almost impossible patience. Great cathedrals rose from the ground, like prayers made of stone. Their arches lifted the eyes upward. Their stained glass caught sunlight and turned it into color that seemed almost alive. Men who would never see the final tower, completed, still carved, measured, lifted, and carried. They gave their whole lives to buildings that belonged to the future. There is something deeply human in that. When the world below feels unstable, people often build upward. They search for order in music, in architecture, in prayer, in thought. The Middle Ages were not only dark corridors and violent lords, they were also the age of scholars bending over manuscripts, monks copying fragile pages by candlelight, and builders shaping stone as if heaven itself might lean down and listen. New universities were beginning to form in places such as Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Naples. These were not quiet schools for polite learning. They were crowded, argumentative, restless centers of inquiry. Young men traveled from far away to sit in cold rooms and listen to masters debate questions that seemed larger than life. What is justice? What is the soul? Can the human mind know God? How should a person live? Into this world came a returning voice from ancient Greece. The writings of Aristotle, long preserved and studied through different cultures and languages, began to move back into Western Europe with new force. His works were not merely old books. They were an entire way of seeing reality. He wrote about nature, logic, ethics, politics, motion, cause, and being itself. He trusted reason with a seriousness that startled many Christian thinkers. For some, Aristotle was a gift. Here was a mind that searched carefully, step by step, refusing easy answers. For others, he was a danger. He had lived before Christ. He did not begin from Scripture. His philosophy seemed to explain the world through causes, forms, purposes, and motion, without always speaking the language of revelation. If reason could travel so far on its own, some wondered what place faith would still hold. Church leaders worried that these books might lead young minds away from belief. Certain teachings were restricted. Certain lectures were forbidden. But ideas are difficult to imprison. A banned book can become more powerful than an approved one, because it carries the taste of hidden fire. Students still read. Teachers still discussed. Questions continued to move from room to room, from city to city, from one restless mind to another. The great question of the age was not merely whether Aristotle was right or wrong. The deeper question was whether truth could be divided against itself. Could reason and faith become enemies? Could the mind discover something that the soul must reject? Or was there a deeper harmony, still hidden, waiting for someone patient enough, disciplined enough, and brave enough to find it? Far from the noise of those debates, in a castle in central Italy, a child was born into a noble family. His family belonged to the world of land, alliances, titles, and military service. They understood how society worked. They knew that sons had purposes. Older sons might carry weapons and inherit responsibilities. Younger sons could be placed in the church, where spiritual office often carried earthly influence. This child was named Thomas. He was the youngest son, and because of that, much of his future seemed decided before his own desires could be known. His parents looked toward the nearby monastery of Monte Cassino, one of the most respected religious houses in Christendom. If Thomas entered there and rose through its ranks, he could bring honor and advantage to his family. To them, This was not cruelty. It was sensible planning. But children are not pieces on a family board, even when families treat them that way. From an early age, Thomas seemed different, not dramatic, not rebellious, not hungry for attention, simply inward. He watched more than he spoke. He absorbed the world slowly, as if he wanted to understand not only what happened, but why it happened. Some children chase noise. Thomas seemed to follow silence. There is an old story about him as a little boy. Perhaps it happened exactly as told. Perhaps memory shaped it over time into something almost symbolic. The story says that when he was still very young, he asked an adult a question with surprising seriousness. What is God? Not where is God? Not who made the world, but what is God? The question was too large for the room that held it. The adult did not know how to answer. How could anyone answer such a thing quickly? Thomas waited, then went away quietly, as if the lack of an answer did not disappoint him but invited him deeper. Many people ask great questions once, and then forget them. Thomas would spend his life returning to that question from every direction, with prayer, philosophy, scripture, argument, and wonder. His family saw a quiet boy who might serve their hopes. History was beginning to see something else. Though history had not yet spoken, the world outside needed someone who could stand between fear and curiosity, between the church's caution and the mind's hunger, between inherited belief and newly recovered reason. No one looking at the silent child in the castle could have known this. And perhaps that is what makes the beginning so beautiful. Destiny does not always arrive dressed in certainty. Sometimes it arrives as a child who says little, listens deeply, and carries one question in his heart, like a candle protected from the wind. Before Thomas Aquinas became a towering figure of Christian thought, before the dumb ox was heard across centuries, he was simply a boy in a violent world, quietly asking what God is. The decision about Thomas's future had been made long before he was old enough to understand it. As the youngest son of a noble family, he was never expected to inherit lands, command soldiers, or continue the family's political legacy. Those responsibilities belonged to his older brothers. His path would lead elsewhere. In the eyes of his parents, the church offered honor, influence, and security. Placing a son within one of the greatest monasteries in Italy was not only an act of faith, it was also a carefully considered investment in the family's future. Standing high upon a rocky hill, the Abbey of Monte Cassino had watched centuries pass beneath its walls. Founded by Saint Benedict hundreds of years earlier, it had survived wars, invasions, and destruction before rising again, each time with remarkable resilience. Kings sought its blessing. Bishops respected its wisdom. Pilgrims traveled long distances simply to pray within its ancient church. For noble families throughout Italy, sending a child there meant opening the door to one of the most respected centers of learning in the Christian world. When Thomas was still only a small boy, he left the warmth of his family home and entered this new world of stone corridors, quiet gardens, and echoing prayer halls. The journey itself was not especially long, yet it marked the beginning of a completely different life. Behind him remained the familiar voices of his parents and brothers. Before him stretched years shaped by discipline, study, and silence. Without realizing it, he had crossed an invisible threshold from childhood into a life that would slowly transform the way he understood both the world and himself. Life, inside the monastery, followed a rhythm that never hurried and rarely changed. Long before the first light reached the surrounding hills, bells called everyone from sleep. The darkness outside still covered the valleys while young students quietly dressed and made their way toward the chapel. Candles flickered against walls that had stood for generations. Prayers rose softly into the cold morning air. Every day began in exactly the same way. teaching patience before any lesson had even begun. After morning prayer came a simple meal shared in near silence. There was no lively conversation around the tables, no laughter echoing through the dining hall. While the others ate bread, porridge, or vegetables gathered from the monastery gardens, one monk stood before them, reading passages from scripture or the writings of respected teachers. Nourishment for the body and nourishment for the soul arrived together. Even ordinary moments became opportunities for reflection, gently reminding every student that learning was never separated from daily life. Many children might have struggled with such discipline. The days were carefully ordered, the rules were strict, and there was very little room for distraction. Yet Thomas appeared unusually comfortable within this quiet routine. He never seemed eager to fill every silence with conversation. While other boys sometimes counted the hours until recreation, he often seemed perfectly content watching sunlight move across the stone floors or listening to birds beyond the monastery walls. Solitude did not make him lonely. It gave his thoughts room to grow. His education began with the foundations every scholar was expected to master. Latin filled his days, not simply as another language, but as the key that unlocked nearly every important book in Western Europe. Grammar lessons demanded endless repetition. Students copied sentences by hand, memorized complex rules, and recited passages until every ending and every construction became familiar. Many found the work exhausting, but Thomas approached it with unusual patience. He seemed to enjoy discovering the quiet order hidden beneath language itself. Once he became comfortable with Latin, new subjects gradually opened before him. Scripture was studied alongside the writings of early church fathers. History was remembered through sacred stories. Music taught harmony, not merely as pleasant sound, but as mathematical balance. Arithmetic and geometry revealed that numbers possessed their own kind of beauty. Every lesson suggested that creation was not random or chaotic. Beneath everything rested an invisible structure waiting to be understood by those willing to observe carefully enough. What impressed his teachers most was not how quickly he answered questions, but how seriously he considered them. If another student responded immediately, Thomas often remained silent. He seemed unwilling to speak until every possibility had been examined inside his own mind. This habit sometimes made him appear uncertain, yet the opposite was true. He simply refused to confuse fast answers with thoughtful ones. While others hurried toward conclusions, he preferred to travel slowly enough to notice what everyone else had overlooked. That quiet habit, however, was not always understood by the boys studying beside him. Children have always been quick to judge what seems different, and medieval classrooms were no exception. Compared with his classmates, Thomas was larger, heavier, and far less interested in competing for attention. He rarely interrupted lessons, rarely boasted about what he knew, and rarely joined noisy conversations. To those who measured intelligence by speed and confidence, his silence seemed almost suspicious. Before long, whispers became jokes, and jokes became a nickname. Some of the boys began calling him the dumb ox. It was an easy comparison for young minds to make. He was broad-shouldered, slow in his movements, and quiet enough to appear detached from everything happening around him. Once the nickname spread, few questioned whether it reflected reality. People often prefer simple stories because they require so little effort. Labeling someone is much easier than taking the time to understand them. Yet beneath that outward stillness, an extraordinary habit was quietly taking shape. Every lesson remained with Thomas long after it had ended. Instead of repeating information immediately, he carried ideas away with him, turning them over again and again in his thoughts. He searched for connections between subjects that others considered unrelated. A passage from scripture might remind him of a grammatical pattern. A lesson about music might echo something he had learned in mathematics. Knowledge slowly became a single woven fabric, instead of separate threads. Some of the older monks gradually noticed what his classmates could not. When they questioned him privately, his answers displayed remarkable depth. He did not merely remember what he had been taught, he understood why one idea naturally led to another. There was a calm precision in the way he explained difficult questions, as though he had spent hours quietly arranging each thought before allowing it to become words. The silence others mocked had become the workshop where his understanding was patiently being built. Looking back across the centuries, it is tempting to imagine that everyone around him must have recognized the signs of future greatness. History rarely unfolds so conveniently. Most people simply saw an obedient student who caused little trouble and attracted even less attention. No one could yet imagine that the quiet child walking through those ancient cloisters would one day reshape Christian philosophy. Greatness almost never announces itself in advance. More often, it hides inside ordinary routines until time finally reveals what patience has been creating all along. The years at Monte Cassino gave Thomas something far more valuable than knowledge alone. They taught him how to remain still in a restless world. They taught him that silence was not emptiness, but preparation. That careful observation could reveal truths hidden from hurried minds, and that genuine wisdom rarely demanded attention for its own sake. These lessons settled so deeply within him that even after he left the monastery, they would continue guiding every question he asked and every answer he would one day offer the world. The peaceful years at Monte Cassino did not last forever. No place, however sacred, could remain untouched by the struggles that swept across medieval Italy. While the monks devoted themselves to prayer and learning, kings, nobles, and emperors continued their endless contests for power beyond the monastery walls. Distant conflicts often seemed like storms gathering on another horizon, too far away to disturb the quiet rhythm of monastic life. Yet history has a way of bringing distant storms closer, one slow step at a time, until even those who sought only peace discover that the world has finally found them. The conflict between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor gradually spread across southern Italy, drawing cities, castles, and monasteries into a struggle that few ordinary people had chosen. Armies marched through regions that had once known only the sound of church bells and farm tools. Roads became less safe. Villages prepared for uncertainty. Even the great Abbey of Monte Cassino, respected throughout Christendom for centuries, could no longer stand apart from the political ambitions surrounding it. Its reputation offered honor, but not immunity from the changing tides of history. When military forces finally reached the region, life inside the monastery changed with astonishing speed. The familiar order that had shaped every hour of Thomas's childhood began to dissolve. Monks who had spent decades preserving books and guiding young students suddenly faced decisions they had never expected to make. Some left to seek safety elsewhere. Others remained only as long as circumstances allowed. The silence that had once carried peace now carried uncertainty, reminding everyone that even places built for eternity still existed within the fragile world of men. For Thomas, the experience must have been quietly heartbreaking. Nearly every meaningful memory of his childhood had been formed within those stone walls. He had learned to read there, to pray there, to think there. Every corridor carried familiar footsteps. Every chapel held memories of countless mornings spent beneath flickering candlelight. Now the place that had once seemed as permanent as the mountains itself appeared vulnerable, proving that no earthly sanctuary could completely escape the reach of politics, violence, or human ambition. Returning to his family home was not simply a journey across the countryside. It was a return to a life that no longer felt entirely familiar. The boy who had entered Monte Cassino years earlier had been shaped by noble expectations. The young man who returned carried something different within him, The discipline of monastic life had quietly transformed his character. He no longer measured the world by wealth or status alone. Instead, he instinctively searched for meaning beneath appearances, asking questions that many people around him had never considered asking. His parents welcomed him warmly, yet they also faced an unexpected dilemma. Their carefully prepared plan for his future had been interrupted by events no family could control. Monte Cassino had represented stability, prestige, and influence. Now its future was uncertain, and so was the future they had imagined for their youngest son. They still hoped he would pursue a respected career within the church, but another place of learning would have to continue the education that had been unexpectedly interrupted. Their attention soon turned toward Naples, where a remarkable university had begun attracting students from across Europe. Unlike the secluded monastery schools, this new institution reflected the changing world beyond monastery walls. Founded under imperial authority, it welcomed scholars from many traditions and encouraged the study of law, medicine, philosophy, rhetoric, and the liberal arts. Knowledge there did not remain hidden behind cloisters. It moved through classrooms, marketplaces, and public debates, becoming part of the living conversation of a rapidly changing society. The journey to Naples introduced Thomas to an entirely different world. Instead of quiet valleys and monastery gardens, he encountered crowded streets alive with merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and travelers arriving from every direction. Ships entered the harbor, carrying spices from the east, fabrics from distant kingdoms, and manuscripts that had crossed continents before reaching Italy. Languages blended together in the markets, while scholars argued passionately beneath stone archways. Compared with Monte Cassino, the city seemed to breathe without ever pausing to catch its breath. For many young students, such a city became a source of endless distraction. Music drifted through busy streets, festivals filled public squares, conversations continued long after sunset in taverns and courtyards. Every day offered new sights, unfamiliar faces, and unexpected opportunities. Yet Thomas seemed strangely untouched by the excitement surrounding him. While others explored the pleasures of urban life, he found himself drawn almost instinctively toward lecture halls, libraries, and conversations where difficult questions were welcomed rather than avoided. The university itself felt unlike anything he had experienced before. Teachers expected students to challenge arguments instead of simply memorizing them. Debates often became vigorous, with scholars defending opposing positions before carefully examining the strengths and weaknesses of each side. Disagreement was not considered disrespectful when pursued honestly. It became another path toward understanding. For Thomas, whose mind had already been trained to search patiently beneath the surface of every idea, this environment felt less intimidating than deeply liberating. It was here that he encountered the writings of Aristotle in their fullest form. For generations, much of the ancient philosopher's work had remained unavailable to Western Europe, preserved through centuries of careful scholarship in distant lands, before gradually returning through new translations. These books did not merely discuss philosophy. They explored nearly every aspect of existence, asking why things changed, what caused movement, how reason worked, and whether the universe itself possessed an intelligible order that human beings could slowly discover. Many readers approached Aristotle with admiration mixed with caution. Some believed his ideas threatened Christian belief because they relied so heavily upon observation and reason. Others welcomed them enthusiastically, convinced that philosophy could answer questions once reserved for theology alone. Thomas refused to choose either extreme without careful reflection. Instead of asking which side should win, he asked a quieter and far more difficult question. What if truth itself could never contradict truth, regardless of where it was discovered? The possibility fascinated him. If God had created both the universe and the human mind, then honest reasoning should never ultimately lead away from the Creator. Perhaps philosophy and faith resembled two lamps, illuminating the same landscape from different directions. Each revealed details the other might not immediately show, yet neither diminished the light of the other. This conviction did not arrive all at once. It grew slowly, nourished by countless hours of reading, listening, reflecting, and quietly testing every new idea against everything he had already learned. Around this same period, another influence entered his life with unexpected force. The Dominican friars had become increasingly visible in Naples, walking the streets in simple black and white habits, preaching among ordinary people, and dedicating themselves to study with remarkable seriousness. Unlike many older religious communities, they did not seek comfort behind monastery walls. They lived close to the people, believing that learning, preaching, and humble service belonged together. Something about their life stirred a deep recognition within the young scholar. The more time Thomas spent listening to the Dominicans, the more clearly he recognized a future he had never previously imagined. They loved books without becoming proud. They defended truth without seeking power. They embraced voluntary poverty while pursuing the highest forms of learning available in their age. They believed that disciplined thought could itself become an act of worship without fully realizing it. Thomas had begun walking toward the decision that would change not only his own life, but eventually the intellectual history of the Western world. The decision did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. No lightning flashed across the sky. No mysterious voice interrupted his prayers. Instead, it grew quietly over months of study, conversation, and reflection. Each lecture he attended, each manuscript he copied, and each discussion he heard seemed to guide him toward the same conclusion. The more he learned about the Dominicans, the more he recognized something strangely familiar within them. They lived with the same devotion he had admired at Monte Cassino. Yet they carried that devotion beyond monastery walls into the busy streets where ordinary people struggled with ordinary lives. The Dominican order was still young compared with the ancient religious communities that had shaped Europe for centuries. Founded only a few decades earlier by Dominic de Guzman, its members believed that truth should never remain locked inside libraries or hidden behind monastery gates. They traveled from city to city, preaching in marketplaces, teaching in universities, and meeting people where they actually lived. Their mission demanded both humility and learning, because they understood that faith could not survive on emotion alone. It also required a mind willing to seek understanding with honesty and discipline. What impressed Thomas most was not their reputation, but their way of life. They owned very little. Their clothing was plain. Their meals were simple. Many walked long distances on foot because they possessed neither horses nor great wealth. Yet wherever they went, they carried books beneath their arms and questions within their minds. They believed that studying scripture, philosophy, and theology was not an escape from serving others. It was one of the most meaningful ways to serve them. Knowledge, when guided by love rather than pride, could become an act of compassion. Until then, Thomas had assumed that learning and holiness belonged mostly inside places like Monte Cassino, protected from the distractions of the outside world. The Dominicans revealed another possibility. They showed him that scholarship could walk through crowded streets, speak with merchants, challenge respected professors, comfort the poor, and still remain deeply rooted in prayer. They did not separate the life of the mind from the life of faith. Instead, they treated both as gifts flowing from the same divine source, each strengthening the other rather than competing against it. The idea settled quietly within him, becoming impossible to ignore. Every time he imagined his future, he found himself returning to the same vision. He did not picture a wealthy abbey, surrounded by influence and noble privilege. He imagined a simpler life, filled with books, teaching, prayer, and service. He imagined spending his days searching for truth rather than position, and helping others discover that truth without demanding admiration for himself. For someone who had always valued silence more than recognition, the attraction was almost irresistible. His decision surprised nearly everyone who knew him. Joining the Dominicans was not considered an honorable advancement for the youngest son of an influential, noble family. In fact, many aristocratic households viewed the new order with quiet suspicion. Unlike older religious communities that possessed extensive lands and considerable wealth, the Dominicans embraced voluntary poverty. They refused many of the comforts that noble families naturally associated with prestige. To parents who had carefully planned their son's future, such a choice seemed not only unnecessary, but almost impossible to understand. When Thomas finally announced that he wished to become a Dominican friar, the news struck his family with extraordinary force. They had expected him to pursue an important position within a respected monastery, perhaps even one day becoming an abbot whose influence would strengthen the family's standing for generations. Instead, their quiet son had chosen an order whose members owned almost nothing, traveled constantly, and dedicated themselves to lives of simplicity. From the family's perspective, it felt as though years of careful planning had suddenly been swept aside by one unexpected decision. His mother could not easily accept what she heard. She had sacrificed much to provide her children with every advantage available to a noble household, and she believed she understood what kind of future would best protect them. In her eyes, the Dominicans offered uncertainty where stability had once existed. They offered poverty where privilege had been expected. They offered obscurity instead of influence. She did not believe her son was rejecting faith. She believed he was rejecting the future that love itself had tried to prepare for him. His brothers reacted even more strongly. Raised within the traditions of aristocratic honor, they viewed family loyalty as something that demanded obedience as well as affection. To them, Thomas's decision appeared reckless, almost embarrassing. They could not understand why a man born into privilege would willingly surrender opportunities that countless others would have pursued without hesitation. They mistook his quiet determination for youthful stubbornness, convinced that time, persuasion, or pressure would eventually convince him to change his mind. Yet beneath his gentle nature lay a firmness that few people had previously noticed. Thomas rarely argued loudly. He seldom defended himself with dramatic speeches. Instead, he possessed another kind of strength, the strength of someone who had already settled the matter within his own conscience. Once he believed he had recognized the path he was meant to follow, turning away from it became more difficult than enduring the disappointment of those he loved. His silence, which others had so often misunderstood, now became the quiet foundation of remarkable courage. There is something deeply human about this moment in his story. History often celebrates great decisions after they have changed the world, yet it rarely lingers on the pain those decisions create within families. Every calling asks something from the person who receives it, but it also asks something from those who love that person. Dreams carefully built over many years sometimes dissolve in a single conversation. Expectations passed from one generation to the next suddenly lose their certainty, leaving behind confusion that no simple explanation can immediately heal. Thomas understood that following his conscience would come at a cost. Although he probably could not imagine how high that cost would become, he hoped his family might eventually accept his decision once they recognized the sincerity behind it. Instead, their resistance only deepened. Disappointment slowly hardened into determination, and determination would soon become action. Those closest to him became convinced that they had one final opportunity to rescue him from what they believed was a terrible mistake. Before long, the conflict would leave the lecture halls of Naples behind and unfold within the walls of his own family, where love and ambition would collide in ways that would test every conviction he possessed. His family believed that time would weaken his resolve. They had seen young men become fascinated by new ideas before, only to abandon them once excitement faded and practical concerns returned. Surely this would be no different. They convinced themselves that Thomas was simply passing through a phase of youthful idealism, enchanted by the simplicity of the Dominicans without fully understanding the sacrifices such a life demanded. If they could separate him from the friars for a little while, they believed reason would eventually guide him back toward the future that had always been intended for him. They underestimated the quiet strength that had been growing within him for years. Thomas had never been a man driven by sudden emotion. Every important decision in his life had been shaped slowly, almost invisibly, through reflection rather than impulse. He did not choose the Dominicans because they were fashionable or because they offered adventure. He chose them because, after long months of prayer and study, he had become convinced that this was the life for which he had been created. Changing his mind would have required him to betray his own conscience. When his superiors decided to send him north for further study, the journey seemed like the natural beginning of his new life. The Dominicans hoped he would continue his education in one of the great centers of learning beyond Italy, surrounded by teachers who could help develop the remarkable gifts they had already begun to notice. The road stretched ahead with promise, and for the first time it appeared that the difficult conversation with his family had finally been left behind. Yet his relatives had no intention of surrendering so easily. They were well connected, influential, and accustomed to solving problems through decisive action. If persuasion had failed, they would attempt something else. Word was quietly sent to Thomas's brothers, men experienced in military life and completely convinced that they were acting for the good of both their family and their younger sibling. They did not see themselves as villains. In their minds, they were rescuing a brother from making the greatest mistake of his life. Somewhere along the road, as Thomas traveled with members of the Dominican order, the unexpected happened. A group of armed horsemen appeared, moving with confidence and purpose. They were not strangers or common bandits searching for valuables. They knew exactly whom they had come to find. Within moments, the quiet journey ended. Thomas was separated from his companions and taken away under the authority of his own family. Carried back toward the castle, he had believed he had already left behind forever. There is something profoundly tragic about that moment. History remembers the event as an abduction, yet those carrying it out almost certainly believed they were acting out of love. They thought they were protecting a younger brother whose judgment had been clouded by youthful enthusiasm. Sometimes the deepest conflicts do not arise between enemies who hate one another. They arise between people who love one another deeply while holding completely different visions of what a good life should look like. Back inside the family castle, every effort was made to change his decision. Conversations lasted for hours. Relatives appealed to his sense of duty, reminding him of the sacrifices his parents had made for him since childhood. They spoke of honor, responsibility, and the reputation of generations who had carried the family name before him. Surely, they argued, he could serve God just as faithfully within a respected abbey, while also preserving the dignity and influence that his birth had made possible. Thomas listened with the same patience that had always defined him. He did not interrupt. He did not answer anger with anger or disappointment with bitterness. When others finished speaking, he responded quietly and simply, explaining that his decision had not been made lightly. He respected his family. He loved them sincerely. Yet there existed another loyalty that stood even deeper than family expectation. Once he believed that God had called him toward a particular path, he could no longer choose another merely to satisfy the wishes of those around him. His calmness frustrated everyone. Arguments often gained strength from resistance, but Thomas offered almost none. He refused to shout. He refused to insult anyone. Instead, he remained astonishingly peaceful, repeating the same conviction with gentle certainty. The more pressure others applied, the more obvious it became that they were not confronting youthful stubbornness. They were confronting a conscience that had already reached its conclusion long before the conversation had begun. Days turned into weeks, and the castle slowly became less a family home than a place of confinement. According to traditional accounts, Thomas was kept under close watch, his movements carefully limited, so that he could not simply leave and return to the Dominicans. The room prepared for him was comfortable enough by ordinary standards, yet comfort could not disguise the fact that his freedom had been taken away. The walls that had once protected him as a child now served another purpose entirely. Many people might have surrendered under such circumstances. Isolation has a way of wearing down even determined hearts. Removed from supportive friends, separated from familiar routines, and surrounded by voices urging compromise, most individuals eventually begin questioning themselves. Perhaps they misunderstood. Perhaps everyone else is right. Perhaps peace can be purchased through one small concession. These quiet doubts often succeed where open conflict fails. Thomas experienced the same loneliness that any human being would have felt. He was not made of stone, nor was he incapable of fear or disappointment. He missed the life he had hoped to begin. He wondered what his fellow friars were doing while he remained confined inside the castle. There were surely moments when the silence around him felt heavier than any burden he had known before. Yet instead of allowing solitude to become an enemy, he transformed it into something strangely familiar. He returned to the habits that had shaped him since childhood. He prayed. He reflected. He studied whatever books he could obtain. He allowed the long, quiet hours to deepen rather than weaken his convictions. While others imagined they were keeping him away from learning, they unknowingly gave him even more time to think. The discipline first learned within the peaceful walls of Monte Cassino now became his greatest source of strength, proving that the deepest freedoms of the human spirit cannot easily be locked behind stone walls. His family had hoped that isolation would separate him from his calling. Instead, it accomplished the opposite. Every passing day seemed to clarify rather than confuse the direction of his life. By trying to force him away from the Dominicans, they revealed just how deeply that calling had already taken root within him. Before long, believing that gentle persuasion had failed, some members of the family would attempt one final test, one aimed not at his intellect, but at the ordinary human weaknesses they assumed every young man inevitably possessed. The longer Thomas remained inside the castle, the more convinced his family became that gentle persuasion would never change his mind. Every conversation ended where it had begun. Every carefully prepared argument dissolved against the quiet certainty of his conscience. He never raised his voice, never answered harsh words with anger, and never accused those around him of cruelty. His calmness only deepened their frustration. They had expected resistance fueled by emotion. Instead, they encountered a peaceful conviction that seemed almost impossible to disturb. Among his brothers, a different plan slowly began to take shape. If reason could not persuade him, and isolation could not weaken him, perhaps temptation would succeed where both had failed. After all, Thomas was still a young man. Surely, beneath his calm exterior, there remained ordinary human desires capable of overcoming even the strongest religious aspirations. Many people throughout history have believed that every conviction has a price. They assumed his would simply require discovering the right temptation. According to the tradition preserved through the centuries, one evening, a young woman was secretly brought into the room where Thomas was being held. She had been instructed to seduce him, hoping that shame or desire would break the determination his family had been unable to overcome through force or argument. Whether she fully understood the purpose behind her presence is impossible to know. She may have believed she was participating in a harmless deception. She may have known exactly what was expected. History leaves her almost entirely silent. For a brief moment, the room that had become a place of prayer and reflection was transformed into something entirely different. The test before Thomas was no longer intellectual. No philosophical argument could answer it. No careful syllogism could remove the tension of the moment. It was simply one human being standing at a crossroads where desire, fear, loneliness, and conviction met each other face to face. Such moments rarely announce themselves in advance. They arrive unexpectedly, asking who we truly are when no audience is watching. The stories tell us that Thomas reacted immediately. Rather than remaining where he stood, he reached for a burning piece of wood from the fireplace and advanced toward the door, driving away the temptation that had entered his room. It was not an act of violence born from anger, but the desperate response of someone determined to protect the direction of his entire life. The woman fled in fear, leaving the room as quickly as she had entered. Silence returned once again, interrupted only by the sound of the fire still burning beside him. After the room had become quiet once more, another remarkable tradition emerged from the memory of those who later wrote about his life. It is said that Thomas approached the wooden door, lifted the charred piece of wood, and carefully traced the shape of a cross upon it. Perhaps no one else witnessed that simple gesture. Perhaps it remained known only because he later spoke of it to trusted companions. Whether every detail occurred exactly as remembered matters less than the meaning people found within the story across the centuries. The cross he marked upon the wood was not a symbol of victory over another person. It was a reminder to himself. Every human life contains moments when the greatest struggle takes place, not against armies or political enemies, but within the hidden chambers of the heart. In those quiet battles, there are no cheering crowds, no public recognition, and often no witnesses at all. Yet the choices made in such moments quietly shape the direction of everything that follows. Later generations added another beautiful tradition to this episode. They believed that after his prayer that evening, Thomas experienced a profound spiritual consolation, as though heaven itself wished to strengthen him for the difficult years still ahead. Whether understood literally or symbolically, the story reflects something important about his character. His strength did not arise because temptation failed to appear. It arose because he continually chose the path he believed to be true, even when every easier road remained open before him. The time continued to pass within the castle. Seasons slowly changed beyond the narrow windows, while Thomas remained separated from the life he longed to begin. Many people imagine imprisonment as endless idleness, yet his days became surprisingly fruitful. He continued reading whenever books were available. He reflected upon scripture, philosophy, and the writings of the church fathers. Ideas gathered quietly inside his mind, forming connections that would later emerge with extraordinary clarity in the works that made him famous throughout the Christian world. Those responsible for guarding him may have believed they were preventing his education. In reality, they unknowingly provided him with long, uninterrupted hours for reflection. There were no crowded lecture halls demanding his attention, no public debates pulling his thoughts in different directions, and no endless distractions of city life. Surrounded by silence once again, he returned to the habits first learned at Monte Cassino. Every day became another opportunity to strengthen the interior discipline that would define the rest of his life. There is an irony running quietly through this chapter of his story. His family hoped to reshape him by limiting his freedom, yet the period of confinement only revealed how impossible it is to imprison a mind that has already discovered its purpose. Walls can confine the body, but they cannot easily restrain conviction. They can interrupt a journey, delay a destination, and test a person's endurance, but they cannot decide what another human being ultimately believes to be true. Gradually, even those closest to him began recognizing that nothing they attempted had altered his resolve. Months had passed, yet the same calm determination remained. He was neither bitter nor defiant. He simply could not pretend to desire a different life than the one he believed God had placed before him. Every failed attempt convinced his family a little more that the quiet young man they had always considered gentle possessed an inner strength none of them had fully understood until now. Eventually, resistance gave way to reluctant acceptance, whether through persuasion from relatives, quiet negotiations with church authorities, or simple recognition that further opposition would accomplish nothing. The decision was finally made to release him. The doors that had remained closed for so long would soon open again. Thomas stepped out of the castle, not as someone defeated by hardship, but as someone refined by it. The road waiting beyond those walls would lead him toward the greatest teachers of his age, where the silent student once mocked as the dumb ox would soon encounter the mentor who recognized the extraordinary voice hidden beneath his quiet nature. Freedom felt unfamiliar at first. After so many months spent within the walls of his family's castle, even the open road must have seemed strangely vast. The same mountains stretched across the horizon, the same villages rested beneath their church towers, and the same rivers continued their quiet journey toward the sea. Yet Thomas himself was no longer the man who had begun that journey. Hardship had not hardened him. Instead, it had given his convictions a deeper stillness, the kind that no longer depended upon comfort, approval, or certainty about what lay ahead. His release marked more than the end of confinement. It marked the true beginning of the vocation he had defended at such great personal cost. The Dominican order welcomed him back, not as someone who had survived a family dispute, but as a brother whose faithfulness had already been tested before his real work had even begun. There was little celebration, no public recognition awaited him. The Dominicans simply understood that his education must continue, because the gifts they had begun to notice deserved careful guidance rather than admiration. Their attention soon turned toward Paris, the intellectual heart of Western Europe. If Rome represented the spiritual center of Latin Christianity, Paris represented its restless mind. Students crossed mountains, rivers, and kingdoms simply for the opportunity to study there. Masters from across Europe gathered to debate philosophy, theology, law, and science before crowded halls filled with eager listeners. Every important intellectual question eventually seemed to arrive in Paris, where it would be examined, challenged, defended, and discussed with extraordinary intensity. The journey north carried Thomas farther from the familiar landscapes of southern Italy than he had ever traveled before. Each passing week introduced new towns, unfamiliar customs, and changing accents. Roads wound through forests, crossed broad rivers, and climbed mountain passes where travelers often paused to rest before continuing. For many companions, such a journey became an adventure filled with endless conversation. Thomas remained much as he had always been, observing quietly, speaking little, and allowing every new experience to settle slowly within his thoughts. When he finally reached Paris, the city must have appeared overwhelming. Narrow streets overflowed with merchants, students, craftsmen, priests, and pilgrims, moving constantly from one destination to another. Church bells echoed above the rooftops from sunrise until evening. Market stalls crowded public squares with food, cloth, parchment, and books. Everywhere people seemed to be discussing something, arguing about something, or searching for someone. Compared with the measured rhythm of Monte Cassino, Paris felt like a living river whose current never slowed. At the center of this remarkable city stood the university, already famous throughout Europe for the seriousness of its scholarship. Its classrooms were not grand buildings in the modern sense, but collections of lecture halls, rented rooms, monastery spaces, and churches where learning unfolded wherever teachers and students could gather. The subjects being discussed there reached into every corner of human understanding: scripture, philosophy, medicine, law, astronomy, ethics, grammar, and logic all met within the same intellectual world, challenging students to think with both discipline and imagination. Among the university's greatest scholars was a Dominican teacher whose reputation had spread far beyond France. His name was Albert, later remembered by history as Albert the Great. Unlike many celebrated intellectuals, Albert possessed an unusually broad curiosity. He studied theology with devotion, yet he also explored botany, zoology, astronomy, mineralogy, and philosophy with equal enthusiasm. To him, the natural world was not a distraction from faith. It was another book written by the same creator who had inspired Scripture. When Thomas first entered Albert's classroom, he found himself in the presence of a teacher unlike any he had previously known. Albert encouraged questions rather than fearing them. He welcomed careful reasoning, even when it led students into difficult territory. Truth, he believed, had nothing to fear from honest inquiry. If an argument proved weak, it should be strengthened rather than protected by authority alone. For a student whose mind had long searched for harmony between faith and reason, such an approach felt deeply liberating. Once again, however, Thomas attracted little attention from those studying beside him. His appearance remained unchanged. He was still larger than many of the other students, still slow in his movements, and still remarkably quiet during discussions. While classmates eagerly competed to impress respected professors with quick answers and polished speeches, Thomas listened patiently, often allowing entire debates to pass before offering a single observation. To many, he seemed almost invisible within the crowded lecture halls. The old misunderstanding soon returned. Some students whispered that the newcomer from Italy lacked confidence. Others assumed he simply struggled to follow the demanding lectures. A few repeated the nickname that had followed him years earlier, calling him the dumb ox, with the same careless certainty shown by boys who had known nothing of the mind hidden beneath his silence. History has an unfortunate habit of repeating itself. Whenever people judge appearances before character has time to reveal itself. Albert, however, observed his new student differently. Years of teaching had taught him that the quickest voice in the room was not always the deepest mind. He noticed the careful attention with which Thomas followed every lecture. He noticed the thoughtful questions asked privately after class, instead of publicly for admiration. Most importantly, he noticed that whenever Thomas finally spoke, his words carried unusual precision. There was no unnecessary ornament, no desire to display cleverness. Each sentence seemed carefully weighed before it left his lips. Rather than measuring intelligence by speed, Albert measured it by depth. He gradually began giving Thomas increasingly difficult assignments, inviting him to examine complicated philosophical questions that challenged even experienced students. Instead of becoming discouraged, Thomas responded with extraordinary diligence. He read patiently, compared opposing arguments fairly, and refused to dismiss ideas simply because they appeared unfamiliar or controversial. Every problem became an invitation to understand more deeply rather than another opportunity to prove himself correct. Their relationship slowly grew into one of the most influential teacher and student partnerships in intellectual history. Albert recognized that the quiet young friar possessed an unusually disciplined mind, capable of absorbing enormous amounts of knowledge without losing humility. Thomas, in turn, admired his teacher not only for his brilliance, but for his willingness to seek truth wherever careful observation and honest reasoning might lead. Neither man viewed learning as a contest for prestige. Both believed it was an act of reverence toward the order woven into creation itself. Yet the wider university community still saw only the surface. Many students continued overlooking the silent friar, sitting patiently among them, unaware that one of the greatest thinkers of the medieval world was quietly preparing his voice. Before long, an unexpected classroom moment would reveal what Albert had already begun to suspect. The young man dismissed as the dumb ox would finally speak with such remarkable clarity that the room itself would fall silent. And a single sentence from his teacher would become one of the most famous predictions ever spoken about a student. The lecture hall was crowded that morning, much like it was on most days in Paris. Students gathered long before the lesson began, eager to secure a place close enough to hear every word spoken by Master Albert. The room carried the familiar sounds of whispered conversations, turning pages, and quiet anticipation. Some students reviewed their notes one final time, while others continued arguments that had begun the previous evening. Among them sat Thomas, silent as always, his attention already fixed upon the lesson that had not yet begun. Over the previous months, many of the students had formed opinions about the quiet friar from Italy. They noticed that he rarely interrupted discussions and almost never tried to impress anyone with displays of learning. In a place where brilliant minds often competed for recognition, his humility seemed unusual. Some interpreted it as wisdom, but many more assumed it revealed a lack of ability. The old nickname followed him once again, passed from one student to another with little thought about whether it reflected the truth. Albert watched these small moments without saying much. Years of teaching had taught him that classrooms often rewarded confidence long before they rewarded understanding. He had seen gifted students speak before thinking, and ordinary students mistaken for geniuses simply because they possessed quick tongues. He had also learned the opposite lesson. Some minds required time to gather themselves, moving slowly, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they refused to sacrifice accuracy for speed. Thomas belonged unmistakably to that second group. During one lecture, Albert presented a difficult philosophical problem that had challenged scholars for generations. The question demanded more than memory. It required careful reasoning, familiarity with scripture, knowledge of Aristotle, and the ability to recognize weaknesses in opposing arguments without dismissing them unfairly. After explaining the issue, the master invited his students to respond. One by one, they offered their thoughts. Some answers were clever. Others were passionate. A few displayed remarkable confidence despite containing serious flaws. Throughout the discussion, Thomas remained exactly as he always did. He listened without interruption, his eyes lowered toward the manuscripts resting before him. Every argument seemed to settle quietly into his mind, where he examined it with patient care. Those sitting nearby probably assumed he had nothing useful to contribute. After all, he had allowed nearly the entire debate to unfold without offering a single opinion. To many observers, silence looked almost identical to uncertainty. When the room finally grew quiet, Albert turned toward the young friar. Instead of calling upon one of the students who had already spoken several times, he invited Thomas to answer. For a brief moment, the room remained perfectly still. Some students exchanged amused glances, expecting little from the quiet man they had so often mocked. Others waited politely, curious to hear whether he would finally say something after remaining silent for so long. Thomas rose slowly and began speaking in the same calm voice that had characterized every conversation throughout his life. There was no dramatic introduction and no attempt to capture attention through clever language. Instead, he carefully summarized the arguments that had already been presented, describing each position with remarkable fairness. He did not ridicule those who disagreed with him. He explained their reasoning so accurately that several students later admitted he had expressed their ideas more clearly than they had managed themselves. Only after presenting every side of the debate did he begin offering his own conclusion. Step by step, he examined each argument, identifying strengths where they existed and gently revealing weaknesses where logic failed to support the conclusion. Every statement followed naturally from the one before it. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing relied upon emotion alone. His reasoning unfolded with such quiet precision that listeners found themselves following each step almost without realizing they had been persuaded. What astonished the room was not simply the intelligence of his answer, it was the balance of it. Thomas never treated philosophy as a contest in which one opponent must be humiliated for another to triumph. He searched instead for whatever portion of truth each position contained before, attempting to build something stronger from them all. Disagreement, in his view, was not an opportunity to defeat another person. It was an invitation to move together toward greater understanding. When he finally finished speaking, the lecture hall remained unusually quiet. The silence felt different from the one that had existed before he began. Earlier, people had been waiting for him to speak. Now, they were absorbing what they had just heard. Many students who had dismissed him as slow suddenly realized they had misunderstood him completely. The man they had considered ordinary possessed a clarity of thought unlike anything they had encountered before. The nickname that had once seemed amusing now felt deeply unfair. Albert looked across the room at the students whose expressions had changed so dramatically, according to the tradition preserved through the centuries. He then spoke words that would become inseparable from the story of Thomas Aquinas. Pointing toward his quiet student, he reminded them of the name they had carelessly repeated for so long. "You call him the dumb ox," he is said to have declared. But the bellowing of this ox will one day be heard throughout the whole world. Whether those exact words were spoken precisely as later generations remembered them can never be known with complete certainty. History often polishes memorable moments until they shine with symbolic beauty. Yet, the story endured because it captured something profoundly true. Albert had recognized what others had overlooked. He understood that genuine greatness often arrives without announcing itself. It grows quietly, hidden beneath patience, humility, and years of disciplined preparation before the world finally becomes capable of recognizing it. From that day forward, Thomas was no longer merely another quiet student sitting among hundreds of scholars in Paris. His remarkable gifts had become visible to those willing to look beyond appearances, yet recognition did not change his character. He did not become louder, more ambitious, or eager for admiration. If anything, he seemed even more determined to devote himself to study rather than reputation. Praise interested him far less than truth, and he understood that one brilliant answer meant very little, unless it was followed by an entire lifetime dedicated to seeking wisdom. Under Albert's guidance, his education entered an entirely new stage. Teacher and student spent countless hours exploring questions that stretched to the limits of human understanding. Together they examined scripture, philosophy, theology, and the natural world with extraordinary patience, laying the foundation for ideas that would eventually reshape Christian thought for centuries. The quiet friar, who had once been mocked for speaking too little, was now preparing to become one of the greatest voices the medieval world would ever produce, though he himself still seemed to care very little whether anyone remembered his name. Under Albert's guidance, Thomas entered the most important intellectual apprenticeship of his life. The celebrated master did far more than assign readings or deliver lectures. He taught his students how to think before they attempted to persuade, how to understand an argument before criticizing it, and how to search patiently for truth, instead of rushing toward conclusions that merely sounded convincing. In every classroom discussion, the pursuit of wisdom mattered far more than the desire to appear intelligent. This approach suited Thomas perfectly, for it reflected the quiet habits he had been developing since childhood. Most medieval scholars approached difficult questions by defending the opinions they already held. Thomas gradually learned another way. Before presenting his own position, he carefully reconstructed the arguments of those who disagreed with him. He wanted to understand not only what they believed, but why thoughtful people found those ideas persuasive. Only after treating every opposing view with fairness would he begin examining its weaknesses. This discipline demanded humility, because it required admitting that even one's opponents might possess part of the truth. That habit would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of his writing. Instead of presenting simple answers, he invited readers into a conversation. Every important question began with competing viewpoints. Each objection received careful attention rather than quick dismissal. Only after every side had been heard did he slowly build his own conclusion, guiding readers step by step until they could see not only where he had arrived, but how each stage of reasoning naturally led to the next. Perhaps this explains why his works still feel remarkably modern, despite being written centuries ago. He never treated disagreement as a personal attack. Ideas could be challenged without insulting the people who held them. Mistakes could be corrected without humiliation. Truth, in his understanding, did not become stronger by shouting louder than opposing voices. It became stronger by patiently demonstrating why it deserved to be trusted. Long before universities spoke about respectful dialogue, Thomas quietly practiced it every time he wrote. During these years, Aristotle remained at the center of nearly every intellectual debate. Some scholars admired the ancient philosopher so completely that they seemed willing to place reason above revelation. Others feared his influence so deeply that they wished his writings had never returned to Western Europe at all. Classrooms became places where these competing visions collided almost daily. Students often felt pressured to choose one side or the other, as though no middle path could possibly exist. Thomas refused to accept that choice. The more carefully he studied both scripture and philosophy, the more convinced he became that truth could never contradict itself. If God was the creator of both the universe and the human mind, then honest reasoning and genuine revelation must ultimately point toward the same reality. Apparent contradictions, he believed, revealed not a flaw in truth itself, but a limitation in human understanding. Whenever faith and reason seemed to conflict, the task was not to abandon one for the other, but to continue searching more carefully. This conviction distinguished him from nearly everyone around him. He did not defend philosophy because he wished to weaken faith, nor did he defend faith by refusing to think philosophically. Instead, he believed both belonged together, each illuminating what the other alone could not fully reveal. Reason could carry the human mind astonishingly far, helping people understand the natural world and many moral truths. Yet reason also encountered questions beyond its own limits, where revelation offered light that logic alone could never discover. His classmates noticed another remarkable quality. As the years passed, Thomas possessed an astonishing memory. Once he had read a manuscript carefully, he seemed able to recall long passages with remarkable accuracy. He listened attentively during lectures, and later repeated complex arguments, almost word for word. Yet his memory never became an excuse for intellectual pride. He collected knowledge not to impress others, but because every new idea became another piece of a much larger picture he was patiently assembling throughout his life. Those who lived beside him often described an almost unbelievable daily routine. While others rested after long hours of study, Thomas frequently continued reading late into the night. He balanced demanding intellectual work with regular prayer, refusing to separate the discipline of the mind from the discipline of the soul. To outside observers, such a schedule might have appeared exhausting. To him, however, study itself had become another form of devotion. Every difficult question invited him to appreciate more deeply the order woven into creation. Despite his growing reputation, very little about his personal life changed. He remained modest in conversation and uninterested in attracting attention. Students who approached him with sincere questions discovered a teacher willing to explain even the most difficult ideas patiently, without making anyone feel foolish for asking. There was no trace of arrogance in the way he shared knowledge. Perhaps he remembered too clearly what it felt like to be underestimated, and therefore took special care never to discourage another mind still learning how to think. Albert gradually entrusted his remarkable student with greater responsibilities. Thomas began assisting with teaching, participating more actively in public debates, and refining ideas that would eventually appear in his own writings. Each new opportunity strengthened his confidence, yet success never altered his deepest habits. Before speaking publicly, he still spent long hours reading, reflecting, and praying. Careful preparation mattered more to him than spontaneous brilliance, because he believed truth deserved patience rather than performance. There is a quiet lesson hidden within these years, though Thomas himself would probably never have stated it so directly. The world often celebrates talent, but lasting wisdom is rarely built upon talent alone. It grows through ordinary days, filled with disciplined work, humble curiosity, and a willingness to remain a student even after others begin calling you a master. The greatest transformations are usually invisible while they are taking place, unfolding page by page, conversation by conversation, year after year. Before long, the young scholar who had once crossed Europe simply to learn would begin stepping into a different role. Universities would invite him not merely to listen, but to teach. Students would gather not to hear what Albert thought, but to hear the quiet Dominican whose careful mind had begun reshaping the greatest intellectual questions of his age. And with that new responsibility would come an even greater challenge, because teaching the truth is often far more difficult than discovering it for oneself. The transition from student to teacher happened so gradually that Thomas himself may hardly have noticed it. One day he was sitting quietly among rows of eager scholars, listening as older masters explained difficult questions. Before long, younger students began gathering around him instead, asking for clarification after lectures or seeking guidance through arguments that had left them confused. Knowledge has a quiet way of revealing those who truly possess it, without demanding attention. Thomas slowly became someone others naturally trusted, whenever the path toward understanding seemed uncertain. Teaching at the University of Paris was unlike anything most people would imagine today. A professor did not simply stand before a room and deliver prepared lessons. Every lecture became an invitation to think. Students questioned their teachers openly, challenged difficult conclusions, and expected every claim to be supported by careful reasoning. Public debates attracted large audiences because ideas carried real consequences. Philosophy shaped theology. Theology influenced politics, and political decisions often affected the lives of countless ordinary people across Europe. Thomas entered this demanding world with the same quiet discipline that had guided him since childhood. He never relied upon dramatic speeches or emotional persuasion. Instead, he prepared patiently, reading widely before every lecture and organizing complicated subjects into clear and logical steps. Students soon discovered that even the most difficult questions became easier to follow when explained by him. He possessed the rare ability to make profound ideas feel approachable without reducing their depth or complexity. His classroom reflected his personality. There was no desire to dominate discussions or overwhelm listeners with displays of learning. Instead, he encouraged careful examination from every side. A difficult question might occupy an entire lesson as he patiently unfolded each possible answer, before revealing which conclusion seemed most faithful to reason and revelation together. Those who attended his lectures often left with more questions than when they had arrived. Yet those questions felt clearer, more meaningful, and far more worthy of continued reflection. During these years, Thomas also began writing with remarkable energy. Ideas that had matured slowly over decades now sought expression beyond the walls of university classrooms. At first, many of his works responded to specific debates or answered practical questions raised by fellow scholars. Yet even these smaller writings displayed an unusual clarity. He refused to write merely to win arguments. Every page revealed the same patient effort to understand opposing views fairly before building something stronger upon a foundation of careful reasoning. His reputation spread steadily across Europe. Bishops requested his advice. Universities invited him to teach. Fellow Dominicans recognized that they possessed a scholar of extraordinary ability, someone capable of addressing the most difficult intellectual challenges facing the Church. Despite growing recognition, very little changed about his personal habits. He continued living simply, following the daily rhythm of prayer, study, teaching, and quiet reflection. The praise of others never seemed to interest him nearly as much as the questions still waiting to be explored. Those who lived alongside him often remarked upon his astonishing capacity for work. He seemed able to dictate several texts in succession, while assistants copied every word onto parchment. After completing one discussion, he would immediately continue another, holding complicated arguments in his memory with remarkable precision. Modern readers sometimes imagine such accounts as exaggerations, yet they reflect the impression repeatedly left upon those who witnessed his daily life. His mind possessed an unusual combination of discipline, concentration, and extraordinary endurance. Even so, Thomas never treated learning as an achievement completed once enough books had been read. Every answer opened another question. Every conclusion invited deeper examination. This attitude kept him intellectually humble. Despite becoming one of the most respected scholars of his generation, he believed that the human mind could genuinely know many truths about the world, yet it could never exhaust the infinite mystery of its creator. Certainty and humility, often treated as opposites, existed peacefully together within his understanding. It was during this period that he began the work for which history remembers him most clearly. He envisioned a comprehensive guide that would gather the central questions of Christian theology into one carefully organized whole. Rather than collecting disconnected opinions, he hoped to create a work that would lead readers step by step through the great themes of faith, using reason to illuminate revelation without allowing either to overshadow the other. The project was breathtaking in both ambition and scope. That work would eventually become known as the Summa Theologiae. Today, it is remembered as one of the greatest achievements of medieval thought. Yet, when Thomas first began writing, he did not imagine it as a monument for future generations. He intended it primarily as a teaching tool for students beginning their theological studies. He wanted newcomers to move through difficult questions with confidence rather than confusion, discovering that even the most profound mysteries could be approached patiently through disciplined inquiry and sincere faith. The structure of the work reflected the habits he had cultivated throughout his life. Every major question began by presenting objections. Readers first encountered arguments that appeared to challenge the position he would later defend. Only after treating those objections, honestly, did Thomas gradually explain his own reasoning, answering each difficulty one by one before arriving at a carefully supported conclusion. This method revealed not only what he believed, but also how he believed thoughtful people should search for truth together. There was something deeply respectful about this approach. Instead of portraying opponents as foolish or dishonest, he assumed that nearly every disagreement contained at least some genuine insight worth preserving. Error, in his view, often emerged not because people loved falsehood, but because they had grasped only part of a much larger reality. The task of the scholar was therefore not merely to defeat opposing arguments, but to understand why they appeared convincing before showing where they ultimately fell short. As his writings continued to circulate, Thomas became one of the leading voices in the intellectual life of the medieval church. Students copied his manuscripts by hand. Fellow teachers debated his conclusions. Church leaders sought his judgment on difficult matters, requiring both theological wisdom and philosophical precision. The quiet boy, once mocked for speaking too little, had become a teacher whose words traveled farther than he himself ever could. Yet the greatest challenge of his life still lay ahead, because the ideas he defended would soon place him at the center of one of the most controversial debates in medieval Europe, where the relationship between faith and reason would be tested more fiercely than ever before. The more widely Thomas's writings spread, the more deeply they entered the greatest intellectual controversy of his generation. Throughout Europe, universities had become places where the recovered works of Aristotle were transforming the way scholars understood the world. Some teachers embraced ancient philosophy with such enthusiasm that they seemed willing to reshape Christian belief around it. Others reacted with equal intensity, insisting that Aristotle represented a dangerous influence capable of leading faithful minds away from revelation. The debate no longer belonged only to classrooms. It had become a question affecting the future direction of Christian thought itself. Many respected theologians feared that reason had begun claiming authority over matters that belonged to faith alone. They worried that students admired philosophical arguments more than sacred scripture, placing too much confidence in human intelligence and too little in divine revelation. If every mystery could eventually be explained through logic, what place remained for faith, humility, or trust in God? These concerns were sincere, and they reflected a genuine desire to protect the spiritual life of the Church during a period of extraordinary intellectual change. At the same time, another group of scholars argued almost the opposite position. Fascinated by Aristotle's remarkable system of thought, they believed philosophy possessed the ability to answer nearly every important question without relying upon revelation. According to some of these thinkers, reason alone could stand as the highest guide for human understanding. If philosophical conclusions appeared to conflict with traditional religious teaching, they suggested that philosophy should not necessarily surrender. This approach disturbed many church leaders, who feared that the foundations of Christian belief were slowly beginning to shift beneath their feet. Thomas watched these debates unfold with careful attention, refusing to join either extreme simply because it promised an easier answer. He understood the concerns of those who feared philosophy, yet he also recognized the extraordinary value of disciplined reasoning. Rather than asking which side should triumph, he returned to the question that had quietly guided him since his years as a student. If all truth ultimately comes from the same Creator, how could genuine truth ever contradict itself? Perhaps the conflict people perceived existed not between faith and reason, but within the limitations of human understanding. This conviction became the foundation of his life's work. Whenever apparent contradictions emerged between philosophy and theology, Thomas refused to settle for quick conclusions. He examined both positions patiently, searching for hidden assumptions, overlooked distinctions, or incomplete arguments that might explain the disagreement. Many intellectual conflicts, he believed, arose because people spoke about different aspects of reality, while assuming they were discussing exactly the same thing. Careful reasoning could often reveal harmony where others saw only opposition. His lectures attracted growing numbers of students because they offered something increasingly rare. Instead of demanding that listeners choose between faith and philosophy, he demonstrated how both could illuminate one another. Reason, he explained, was a gift given by God, and therefore deserved to be exercised with honesty and courage. Revelation, however, reached beyond the limits of reason, offering knowledge that human investigation alone could never fully discover. Each possessed its proper place, and together they formed a more complete vision of truth than either could achieve alone. Not everyone accepted his conclusions. Some critics believed he granted philosophy too much authority, worrying that his admiration for Aristotle threatened the simplicity of Christian belief. Others argued that he remained too loyal to theology, preventing philosophy from pursuing its questions with complete independence. In an unusual way, opposition arrived from both directions at once. Those who stood at opposite ends of the debate often found themselves criticizing the same man, each convinced he had compromised too much with the other side. Such criticism never seemed to disturb Thomas as deeply as people expected. He had learned long ago that misunderstanding often accompanies sincere work. After all, he had once spent years being dismissed as the dumb ox, simply because others judged appearances more quickly than character. Public disagreement, therefore, did not surprise him. If anything, it reminded him that truth rarely satisfies those who prefer simple answers to complicated questions. Patience remained his greatest ally, just as it had during every earlier chapter of his life. Despite increasing controversy, he continued writing with remarkable consistency. Each manuscript reflected the same disciplined structure, the same respect for opposing arguments, and the same confidence that truth deserved careful examination rather than emotional reaction. Readers encountered neither arrogance nor unnecessary complexity. Even when discussing subjects of extraordinary difficulty, Thomas wrote as though he were quietly guiding a thoughtful companion through unfamiliar territory, never rushing ahead and never leaving sincere questions unanswered without careful consideration. What made his work so enduring was not merely the brilliance of individual arguments, it was the spirit in which those arguments were offered. He believed that intellectual honesty required acknowledging uncertainty, wherever certainty had not yet been earned. He distinguished between questions reason could answer and mysteries that ultimately invited humble acceptance. This balance protected him from the pride that sometimes accompanies great learning. No matter how much he understood, he remained aware that the infinite reality of God would always exceed the grasp of even the greatest human mind. Students who studied under him often carried away more than philosophical knowledge. They observed a man whose daily life reflected the very harmony he described in his writings. Prayer did not interrupt his scholarship. Scholarship did not weaken his prayer. The two belonged together so naturally that separating them would have seemed impossible. Those who expected a brilliant intellectual discovered instead a remarkably gentle teacher. Those who expected an austere theologian found someone willing to listen patiently before offering advice. His character gave quiet credibility to the ideas he defended. As the years passed, even many former critics began recognizing the extraordinary coherence of his vision. Debates that had once seemed hopelessly divided gradually found new possibilities through his careful distinctions. Younger scholars discovered that they no longer needed to fear philosophy in order to remain faithful, nor abandon faith in order to think seriously. A bridge had begun taking shape where many had expected only conflict. It was built slowly, argument by argument, page by page, through the patient labor of one man who believed that truth never needed to compete against itself. Yet while the intellectual world increasingly celebrated his achievements, something unexpected was quietly unfolding within Thomas himself. After decades devoted to writing, teaching, and explaining the deepest mysteries of faith, he would soon experience an event so profound that it would change the way he looked upon everything he had accomplished. The man whose words had shaped an entire generation was approaching a silence far deeper than any he had known before. A silence that no philosophical argument could fully describe. After years of teaching, writing, traveling, and answering questions that had occupied the greatest minds of his age, Thomas seemed to have reached the height of his influence. Kings respected him. Bishops sought his counsel. Students copied his manuscripts by hand, carrying them across Europe, where they would be studied in monasteries, universities, and cathedral schools. His ideas had begun shaping an entire generation of scholars, and the great work that had consumed so much of his life continued to grow, page after page, as though it might one day contain every important question a human being could ask about God and creation. To those observing him from the outside, it appeared that his life's purpose had been fulfilled. He had accomplished what few thinkers in history could ever hope to achieve. He had built a remarkable bridge between faith and reason, showing that careful philosophy need not threaten Christian belief, but could instead deepen its understanding. The quiet young man once mocked as the dumb ox had indeed become a voice heard across the Christian world, just as his old teacher had predicted many years before in a crowded classroom in Paris. Yet history has an unusual way of reminding even its greatest figures that there are experiences no amount of learning can fully explain. During the final years of his life, while continuing his ordinary rhythm of prayer and study, Thomas underwent an event that forever changed the way he looked upon everything he had written. The details remain mysterious, preserved only through brief accounts recorded by those who knew him. Whatever happened took place, not before a crowd, but in the quiet intimacy of prayer, where words often become too small for what the soul encounters. After celebrating Mass one morning, those close to him noticed something different. The man who usually returned eagerly to his writing desk now remained unusually silent. Assistants waited for new pages to dictate, but none came. Friends gently encouraged him to continue the great theological work that still remained unfinished. Instead of reaching for his manuscripts, Thomas simply looked at them with an expression no one present could fully understand. Something within him had changed in a way that resisted explanation. When asked why he had stopped writing, he gave an answer that has echoed through history ever since. Compared with what had been revealed to him, he said, everything he had written seemed like straw. The words astonished everyone who heard them. This was the same man whose books had transformed theological study throughout Europe, whose arguments had guided countless students, and whose intellectual achievements already appeared extraordinary, yet standing before a mystery beyond language. Even those magnificent works suddenly seemed painfully limited in his own eyes. His statement has often been misunderstood. He was not rejecting the value of reason, nor dismissing the years he had devoted to scholarship. Rather, he was acknowledging something that every truly humble thinker eventually discovers. However far the human mind may travel, there remains a horizon it cannot fully cross. Language can point toward truth. Philosophy can illuminate it. Theology can deepen our understanding of it. Yet the living reality of God always exceeds the finest words human beings are capable of arranging upon a page. Perhaps this explains why Thomas remained so remarkably humble throughout his life, despite receiving admiration from every direction. He had never believed knowledge existed to make a person feel superior. Every genuine insight only revealed how much remained beyond human understanding. The farther he traveled into wisdom, the more clearly he perceived the endless depth still waiting before him. For him, humility was not pretending to know less than he did. It was recognizing that infinity could never be contained within even the greatest human intellect. Not long afterward, another journey called him away from the classrooms and libraries that had defined so much of his life. Pope Gregory X invited him to attend the Second Council of Lyon, where church leaders would gather to discuss matters of profound importance for the future of Christianity. Despite declining health, Thomas accepted the request and began traveling north once again. Even after decades of labor, he continued answering every call to serve, never imagining that this would become the final journey of his earthly life. The road proved difficult for a man whose strength had already begun to fade. Somewhere along the way, he became seriously ill after suffering an accident that left him increasingly weak. Unable to continue, he was welcomed into the Cistercian Abbey of Fossanova, where monks cared for him with the same quiet devotion that had surrounded his own childhood at Monte Cassino many years before. There was a gentle symmetry in those final days. The life that had begun within the peace of a monastery would also find its earthly ending within one. Even as illness gradually overcame him, those around him noticed the same qualities that had always defined his character. There were no dramatic speeches, no desperate attempts to preserve his reputation, and no concern about how history might remember him. He prayed, reflected, and received the care offered by the monks with gratitude. The extraordinary scholar, whose writings had reached every corner of Europe, faced death with the same quiet composure that had once carried him through misunderstanding, imprisonment, temptation, and endless years of intellectual struggle. On the 7th day of March in the year 1274, Thomas Aquinas quietly passed from this world. He was only about 49 years old. The immense work he had hoped to complete remained unfinished, leaving later generations to wonder what further insights might have emerged had he been granted more time. Yet perhaps incompleteness itself carried a gentle lesson. No human life, however brilliant, ever succeeds in saying everything that could be said. Every generation receives only part of the conversation before passing it forward to those who come after. The years following his death revealed just how deeply his influence had already taken root. His writings continued spreading throughout Europe, shaping universities, inspiring theologians, and guiding countless students searching for harmony between faith and reason. Debates that had once surrounded his ideas slowly gave way to admiration as more scholars recognized the remarkable balance of his thought. Eventually, the Church declared him a saint, and later honored him with the title of Doctor of the Church, acknowledging that his quiet labor had become one of Christianity's greatest intellectual treasures. Perhaps the most beautiful part of his story is not that he became famous, but that fame never appeared to matter very much to him. The boy who once asked what God is never stopped asking. The young student mocked for his silence never learned to love applause. The teacher admired across Europe never believed wisdom belonged to him alone. He spent his entire life searching, listening, questioning, and trusting that truth was worth following wherever it patiently led. And maybe that is why, after so many centuries, his story still feels unexpectedly close to our own. We live in a world that rewards quick opinions, constant noise, and immediate certainty. Thomas reminds us of another way of living, a slower way, a quieter way, one that listens before speaking, seeks before judging, and remains humble even when surrounded by success. Perhaps the greatest voices in history are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are simply the ones that spent a lifetime learning how to listen before they ever chose to speak.